My personal history with the book is, I'll give a little, I'll explain an anecdote and how the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta came to me. At the time I was under 20, and I'd been in the Krishna organization, Krishna Movement, Iskcon, for about a few years, since 1973. And Prabhupada had put incredible amount of time into doing extensive translations and purports on the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta. And in those days there wasn't computers. And the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust was based in Los Angeles, the printing unit that was publishing all of the books. And when I joined, there was hardly any volumes of the Bhagavat translated and printed, and over the years more and more volumes got translated, more and more books came out. And Prabhupada had actually published ahead of the whole series of Caitanya-Caritāmṛta a little volume called Lord Chaitanya in 5 Features, which was a very important chapter. It was like a preview. So we had this little book, and it was fantastic. I found it incredibly interesting because Prabhupada had already done a summary called Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. So this is up to then. That's where most of us Westerners, because we didn't know Bengali, we hadn't studied the original text. We were completely dependent on Prabhupada's translations and his commentaries. So we had Teachings of Lord Chaitanya and Lord Chaitanya in 5 Features, a little section from the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta. And Prabhupada put a lot of pressure. It was one of the famous times when he actually kind of said, "I want this book." He was so adamant that they had to be printed very, very quickly that he told, the devotees decided to go on a marathon to fulfill his wish. And so devotees from all over the world, artists and people connected with printing and everything, came to Los Angeles, and there was a kind of a 24-hour shift where they did all the typesetting, all the Bengali. It was an incredible project, and in an incredibly quick period of time, all the volumes were translated, because they're quite voluminous, because Prabhupada we had the Bengali text, the transliteration, the word for word, the translation, and then a purport. And when they arrived en masse to Amsterdam. And another thing was, just before we had the Caitanya-Caritāmṛtas arrive, we had the installation of the murtis of Gaur-Nitai, beautiful brass murtis. Up to then we just had Jagannath, Baladev and Subhadra. And so Mahaprabhu and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda had really come into Amsterdam in 2 ways. First, in the form of the murtis, golden vigrahas, as Mahaprabhu was called, Gora. And then they came in the form of these big, big boxes full of volumes. And I think there's 17 volumes in the whole series. You have the Adi Leela, Madhya Leela and Antya Leela. They arrived in these big boxes. A big van went to the airport in Amsterdam. They'd come from Los Angeles. We put them up the steps, ripped open these boxes. It was like a party. It was like Christmas. And there they were, volume after volume of these incredibly beautiful golden books with a golden cover and these lovely illustrations, fully illustrated. And everyone was like kind of picking different books and opening the pictures and going, "Wow, look at this one, and look at Chaitanya Mahaprabhu doing this." There was so much excitement. For us, it was all very new. We were discovering this was our life and soul, and now we were getting. It was like food for the soul. And I took the first big fat volume, which is the first volume of the Adi Leela, and I just kind of took it, and that was mine. And I just started right from the beginning. And I have to say, up till then, we'd had Bhagavatam, and I'd read all the other books and Bhagavad Gita, and I must say the Bhagavatam is very ancient. It's set in another time, and then suddenly you're reading a document, a hagiography, a spiritual biography that is set about 500 years before in Bengal. And everything seemed so much more immediate, and I could relate to everything intensely. And we had quite a few Bengali bhajans at this time that had been recorded in Bengal, and we had some of these bhajans playing. And so I started to enter into this world of Bengal through the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta. Now, the interesting thing is that the purports to the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, Prabhupada used extensively his own guru's purports, Bhaktivedanta Swami Thakur, and his father, Bhaktivedanta Thakur, who was the founder of this lineage, this branch of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And so when you read the stories of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, where it starts off with his birth and his appearance, and all the preamble to his appearance. And not only that, it has a whole kind of theological introduction in the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, actually describing who is Chaitanya. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu didn't come just by himself, just like Sri Krishna didn't come by himself. And this is the whole kind of what the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta is alluding to, that actually Sri Krishna Chaitanya is actually Krishna himself, and it's the whole story of his avatar. And before Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, there had been two other literatures that came before it: Chaitanya Mangala by Lochan Das Thakur and Chaitanya Bhagavat by Vrindavan Das Thakur. And Krishnas Kavirāja Gosvāmī, who is the author of the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, he constantly refers back to these other biographies. And it's a fantastic biography. Krishnas Kavirāja himself was a disciple of Raghunath Das Goswami, who was one of the Six Goswamis and was one of the very youngest. And he had been in Puri during the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Krishnas Kavirāja never was present during the actual time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he was the servant of Swarup Damodar, who was the personal servant of Chaitanya in Puri for the last 13 years of his life. So the early biographies, they don't deal with the latter part so much. And so a lot of the information from Caitanya-Caritāmṛta that Krishnas Kavirāja got, this comes from this Kadacha, from this diary that Raghunath Das Goswami had. And another interesting thing is that he was very, very old, Krishnas Kavirāja, when he wrote Caitanya-Caritāmṛta. He keeps saying, my eyes are failing me, my health, and I'm praying to Gauranga Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that he will give me strength so that I can complete this book. And when he finished the text, they brought it before Govindaji, the main deity, Murti of Braj, and the garland fell. And that was considered a very, very special sign that this book was being enjoyed and chosen by Govinda himself and appreciated as beautiful expression of who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was and is. And so I started my journey into this incredible text. And you asked me, I think, you wanted to know kind of what it kind of made me feel. What did it do? Well, this whole science of bhakti, it's very subtle. And you have to understand that while I was reading this text, I wasn't just casually reading this text. I wasn't kind of at college or had a job. I was living a lifestyle before I even started reading this for 3 years, which was an incredibly focused, saturated, devotional lifestyle, 24 hours a day. All my senses, my mind was all honed and primed to kind of receive this kind of message in a very kind of, I must say, I was kind of very pure and innocent, especially living in the capital of sex, drugs and rock and roll in Amsterdam. And we had a beautiful kind of spiritual oasis bubble in a beautiful community that we had in Amsterdam at that time. And what happened would be, I got such a taste, a ruchi, a rasa, from all the characters and the personalities involved, that Krishna and Radha and the whole mood of Braj became alive by entering into the mood of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And also what I found very interesting is the whole kind of the context about where Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared in 1486 in Navadvip. The whole history, the mood of the different Vaishnavas who were there before Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And the main personalities in the kind of Gaudiya Vaishnava pantheon are what's called the Panchatattva. Panchatattva is a term that's used also in Tantra, but this is a different reference. And that first little book that came out, the Lord Chaitanya and Five Features, was focusing a lot on that. And that is Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Advaita Acharya, Gadadhar, and Srivas. And they're very intrinsic in the whole understanding of Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, that God is one and he's simultaneously different, and he has different aspects to himself. And according to Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, these five personalities together represent a kind of a complete understanding of all the different principles. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was revealed as Radha and Krishna. Krishna in the mood of Radha, and Nityananda is Balaram. And Sri Advaitacharya, he is Mahavishnu and sometimes he's Sadashiva combined. And Gadadhar is very complex, he is Radha Shakti. And Srivas, he he's Narada, and Narada represents the liberated soul in his purest sense. So that's a little introduction to the first bit of the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, and I'm going to carry on again in a little minute and explain a little more. In the first part of the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, in the Adilila, apart from the theological introduction, it's all about the appearance of Chaitanya. He was called Nimai because he was born under a neem tree. And it's very beautiful. You enter into that mood. You're there in these thatched Bengali cottages with bamboo, mud floors, the tulsi plant in the middle. You're seeing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu playing around. He was very beautiful and an extremely attractive child, and there's lots of amazing miracles and stories about his youth. And then it becomes a kind of a bit of a tragedy. There's a lot of loss. First, his elder brother leaves. We don't hear much about his elder brother Vishwarup. He leaves. And then his father passes, Jagannath Mishra. And then he marries Loki Priya, and who he was in love with as a child, and they got married. And actually the parents didn't really want to marry because she wasn't from a very high caste family, but he was deeply in love with her. And he was a scholar. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Navadvip, the place where Mahaprabhu was born, was like they considered like a kind of Cambridge university town on the banks of the Ganga, and students came from all over to study these tolls, Sanskrit tolls. And that's one of the reasons why Jagannath Mishra, Mahaprabhu's father, came from Sylhet, which is now in Bangladesh, near Meghalaya, and came and settled there. And many of the Vaishnavas, like Advaita Acharya as well, they came from that area. And so it was quite a prominent place at that time for learning and nyaya, logic. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was very precocious and very, very intelligent, extremely beautiful and very proud. And all of his youth is about his arrogance, actually. He's quite proud and making jokes and making puns. And he developed a following. He had his own school. And all the Vaishnavas knew that he was special, and they were just waiting for something to happen. And so, I didn't finish the story. When he went off to Bangladesh, he went off to his kind of roots to do some preaching, to get some Lakshmi, some money. And while he was away, his wife died. And it's a big tragedy. He comes back and his wife is not there, and they say that she got bitten by a snake, and some people call it the snake of separation. There's lots of interpretations, and it's very moving. And so gradually there's all this loss, there's this whole mood of viraha, separation, that Mahaprabhu's going through. And Sachi Ma, she's the archetypal Bengali mother. If you go to Bengal and people, there's different role models. Sachi his mother is the archetypal role model. Some people Westerners would try to interpret as kind of some neurotic, overindulgent kind of thing, which I've come across, but they don't quite understand the whole Bengali culture and the ras. And then what happens is Mahaprabhu goes to Gaya, and that's where everything changes, because in Gaya there's the Bindu Madhava temple to Gadadhar Vishnu, and his footprints of Vishnu embedded there in a rock. And it's the place where you go to offer pinda to your forefathers. So this was to do for his father, Jagannath Mishra. But while he was there, two things happened. He met his guru, Ishwara Puri, one of his gurus, and while seeing the footprints of Vishnu, he went into an incredible ecstasy. And this was the turning point where he completely changed, and it's like, this is where the real purpose of Mahaprabhu's descent and his real nature became manifested after this time. And when he returned to Navadvip after this journey, he was transformed. People couldn't understand. Before he was haughty and proud, and now he was so emotional that while his students were there, they would be sitting and talking, and any reference that would come to Krishna, he would just go off into a swoon and an ecstasy and start talking, and they would thought that he had gone mad, basically. A lot of people thought he had kind of lost it. And anyway, the story is a whole journey of Mahaprabhu's journey, and how then the other Vaishnavas realized that he's opening to his real kind of mission on earth. And then the beginning of the whole Sankirtan movement actually wasn't public. It was actually in seclusion in the house of Srivas Thakur, who was a kind of the neighbor to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And there's amazing stories of the kirtan that went on in the house. Now, in those days, and also now people looking at the history, they were kind of a noisy bunch. You know, they would be a kind of akin. You have to understand, at that time as well, there was a very strict caste system controlled by what were called smarta Brahmins, but also politically it was ruled by the Muslims. And there was a Qazi there, called Chand Qazi, in that local area, and he was working under Hussein Shah, who was the main in charge of Bengal, based in Malada. And so this is kind of the environment and the setting that's happening. And what happened was, many of the neighbours and people, they would say, who are these people disrupting the peace and making all this noise until all times of the night? And they would be going into ecstasies and barbs. Something was really brewing. And it didn't take long for it to kind of come out of the confines of the house of Srivas Thakur, because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had different followers. And Nityananda, specifically, and Javan Haridas, who was from a Muslim family, they were specifically directed by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to spread this to the poor people, the lower caste. Now, this was very revolutionary, because mantras, the chanting of the name of God, was meant to be exclusively for Brahmins. And this was so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was considered sometimes in Bengal first as a social reformer. There's a big thing in Bengal about it. A lot of it starting from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and all the later reformers like Ram Mohan Roy and Tagore and everybody. A lot of it was inspired, especially when in the one part of what's going to happen next in the story is that as the Sankirtan movement gets more and more popular and spreads out onto the street, and it becomes very popular amongst everybody, all the castes, this caused a bit of a social disruption to the higher caste Brahmins. So they go to Chand Qazi, and Chand Qazi sends his men out to break the clay drums and stop them. And the devotees are harassed, and they come back to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he actually gets angry, and no one's actually really sure what's going to happen. They think there could be a huge... Is Krishna going to is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu going to be like Krishna? Is he going to take his chakra? Is he going to chop off the heads of the demons, as it says the incarnations? But that is not what happens. And so what actually happens is most probably one of the first civil disobedience events in India, long before Gandhi. Maybe he had got inspired by it. And it's described thousands of people. They went through over the farms with their torches in the night, and the Chand Qazi they could hear this, thousands of people coming, and they were he was very frightened. But actually it ended up with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu having a really wonderful discussion with the Qazi about all sorts of things, and the Qazi revealing that actually in the night before Nrsimhadev had appeared to him and scratched his chest with his nail and said, leave off the Caitanyas. And so today you can go, as you're coming down into Mayapur, I can't remember the name of the village, there is a beautiful tree and there's a tomb to Chand Qazi, because Chand Qazi, he allowed, after this discussion, he said, please allow the kirtan to go ahead, because when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu explained it, he explained that actually he was much more sympathetic to Chaitanya and his people than actually the caste Brahmins. So that's a very big part of the whole Chaitanya Mahaprabhu story. The rise that's quite phenomenal. It was like an explosion, and it poured over, and then it developed to a point where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu got remarried to Vishnu Priya, and he made this very drastic decision. And it's in dramas in Bengal, this is one of the big, it's akin to, in the Krishna Leela, Akrura Daman, where Akrura comes from Mathura to bring Krishna and Balaram away from Vrindavan to Mathura to fulfill the next part of their Leela on earth. And it's very emotional with all the gopis and residents in Vairaj, because it's the last time that they'll see Chaitanya. So nobody in Navadvip, and all this phenomena from the time of Gaya to this time of what's Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's going to take sannyas. He decides to take sannyas. And it describes that to be a great leader at that time and a great teacher, if one wasn't a sannyasi or a renunciate, one wouldn't be taken very seriously. And Mahaprabhu was extremely beautiful. He was described to be over 7 foot tall. He had, like a Mahapurush, they have all these features and characteristics, the measurements of their limbs. His arms came down below his knees. He had beautiful lotus eyes. He had beautiful long curly hair. It's one of the great attractive things of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, that Mahaprabhu was just so beautiful and attractive. And so what happened was, there's this very famous picture where Mahaprabhu is having his head shaved by the barber, because Mahaprabhu leaves at night and he goes across the Ganga and he goes away to a place called Katwa, and he takes sannyas from Keshava Bharati. And this is also quite unusual, because he took initiation in the Dashanami Sampradaya, the Shaivite Sampradaya, because that was the most prominent renunciant Sampradayas at that time, and in the Bharati, and he took the name Śrī Caitanya. So, and he didn't have a tuft of hair, he didn't wear kuntimala, and he had an ekdanda and saffron cloth. Now, I won't get into all the details of the story, but these are the most prominent ones, because after that, there's a lot of complex details, but Chaitanya basically leaves after saying, his mother actually says, please, if you're going to go off, at least stay in Puri when you settle, so that we can hear news of you. So, due to this, his mother's wish, this is kind of a main part of the story, that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, after leaving Navadvip, went on pedal yatra on his feet, as everybody kind of went in those days. And it's an amazing story how he left. He goes to Puri as a sannyas. Amazing things happen there. He leaves and he goes on a journey for many, many years, meeting. There's many. What's very beautiful about the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta is you get to hear all these amazing different conversations with different types of Vaishnavas from different parts of India, with Buddhists. He meets Pathans on the way, where that's a very interesting story, where he's in an ecstasy and he has his servant with him, and he's got foam coming out of his mouth in this ecstasy, and these Pathan soldiers come by and they think that his servants drugged him. And so they keep him arrested. He's going, no, my masters, and they wait for Mahaprabhu to come out of his ecstasy, his trance, and then they understand that this servant wasn't trying to kill him. It's very unusual. You don't often see people going into these ecstasies, and then there's a wonderful conversation. So Caitanya-Caritāmṛta is full of these descriptions. Mahaprabhu going to Vrindavan, travelling, all the different great followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that were going to create all the literature that was going to follow. They are all described. When he comes to Puri, or how all the Vaishnavas used to come from Bengal on foot, and they used to come every year to see Chaitanya. The amazing kirtans that were performed, the miracles where Chaitanya would expand into different forms, into the different kirtan parties, like Krishna in the Rasa Leela, and everybody could see Mahaprabhu in their own group simultaneously. And the king, Maharaj Prataparudra of the time, was a great devotee of Chaitanya. So it's got a lot of cultural anecdotes, and the purports by Srila Prabhupada that include Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and Bhaktivedanta Thakur, they bring you into the contemporary descriptions, because sometimes when he's describing a Vaishnava in a certain place in Bengal, he will say, now, if you catch the train from so-and-so station and go here, and then catch a bus here, you can get to this place called a Shripad, and you can meet so-and-so Goswami, who's the 13th generation from this original Vaishnava. And so when I was reading this book, I got such a beautiful overview of Bengal and listening to Bengali kirtans that I just could not wait to go. So when I first arrived in Bengal, the first place where I went after going to Calcutta was the birthplace of Chaitanya, where I spent 2 weeks. And as soon as I went there, I just had to come back. I thought, this is it. And so later on in my journeys, I've described in other interviews, I went to Bangladesh, and I wanted to enter into and see the culture that's been going on for hundreds of years, that's been following this culture, and it was a wonderful experience. And so I've got a long journey, and Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, even though I haven't read it completely for years, it's one of the most stimulating, informative, and most revealing texts available on bhakti, and specifically the form of bhakti in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Yeah, I'd like to just carry on a little bit more about the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, because just by talking about it I've become quite inspired. In fact, this is what these books do to you, and people kind of wonder, what is all this bhakti thing? Why are they so into these books and these texts? And this is one of the central features of Vaishnavism, is Shravanam, Kirtanam and Smaranam. Hearing, chanting, remembering. Because Vaishnavas are not at all interested, at all, in obliterating their identities or attracted to a formless Godhead. They are attracted to the supreme Swayam Bhagavan, God, the fountainhead of all ecstatic, attractive, unlimited, infinite attributes, who's completely complete. And he is Abhignya Swarat, which means he's fully independent but fully conscious at the same time. And this is part of the whole mystery of the whole Bhagavat lineage, who was Krishna, the great mystery, all the stories of Indra and all the Devas and Brahma can't figuring out who this little blue boy is, why he's got so much power, why he's so attractive, who is he? So that's the whole kind of story and the conclusion of the Bhagavat, the mystery of Swayam Bhagavan, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. So in the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta, what happens to you when you go into these literatures is that they are non-ordinary. They are revelations. Now, people who are, from an academic point of view, are reading these texts and trying to understand them as, historical documents in the academic way are barking up the wrong tree, and they understand that anyway, and they have their own interpretation of what they called hagiographies. Now, what hagiography is, it's a kind of a mixture of historical account and the spiritual revelation that's coming through the hearts of the devotees. Because how do we know about Krishna? We know about Krishna and Bhakti through those who are devotees of Krishna and Bhakti. And the reason we become attracted to Bhakti is because we see those personalities, and Krishna within their hearts shines through. They are carrying Krishna in their hearts. And somebody once asked Prabhupada, how can you tell who a devotee of Krishna is? And he said, it's very easy. Somebody who reminds you of Krishna. That's who a devotee of Krishna is. And it's a kind of a chain reaction, because that's what happened when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went around, and a lot of the great mystics and saints, they just appear in places, and it's described that people just had to see Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They would go into ecstasy, and someone would see them, and they would go into ecstasy, and all these incredible miracles that people can't possibly normally understand. But this is the kind of the power and the Shakti of Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. And there's also many interesting conversations between different Vaishnavas. There's a fantastic conversation between Yavan Haridas and somebody else, I can't remember. And it's all, and maybe it was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, and it was all about, because I haven't read the book for quite a few years, and it's all about why has Chaitanya Mahaprabhu come, and what is he coming to do, apart from his internal mission to taste as Krishna, to taste the mood of Radha. But he's actually come. And I was going, in another interview I mentioned this, I read another book, someone said, I think this whole thing that's going on at the moment is all about cosmic amnesty. Now, according to the Vaishnava traditions, everything that exists in this world comes from God. And in the Bible it says we're created in the image of God, and God has many moods. As we read in the Bhagavat, we realize God can be angry, and he appears in the form of Narasingha. And in that mood of Narasingha, he is very, very, very angry. And I like to look at the analogy like that God is like the king, and this material world, which is called Durga, a fortress, is a bit like a jail. And the jail exists due to the laws that have been created by the king. He owns these things. But sometimes the king might want to come and, see the prison, check out the prisoners, see how they're doing, and he comes in all his dress and everything, and all the prisoners are going, who's this dude? And some people say it's the king, and some people go, he's just like one of us, he's in the jail, So there's different interpretations about, who the king is and why the jail is according to your perspective. But the king's got different moods, and he's kind of like law and order, the cosmos, the universe, justice. That's one aspect of the Supreme's nature. Another aspect is that on a really good day, like the king, his grandson may be born, and he'll just be so happy that he'll think, sod the laws, forget justice, release all the prisoners, let them all free, I feel happy. Let's forget justice for a day. Let's just kind of let compassion and love rule. So, this is my way of trying to understand who is Krishna Chaitanya, that I think that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is described as Namo Mahabhadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namani Gaura Trishena Mahava. He's the most munificent of all the different forms of Krishna, because he's appeared in Kali Yuga and we're all quite screwed up. Everything's upside down. It's the age of quarrel and hypocrisy. And so when Krishna was speaking and kind of, you've got to surrender, you've got to do this, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he's come and he's saying, here I am. Here's Krishna. I'm giving you in the form of my name, in this mood of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and everything is in that name. Everything is in that holy name. Harinama, 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 Eva Kevalam, Kalonya Steva Nasteva Nasteva Gatiranyataha. So this is the whole mission of Mahaprabhu, that he is Krishna come to liberate everybody. And he is one of the main personality, in my opinion, and this is part of the transcendental secret, steering this divine plan. And ultimately, he's offering divine love to everybody. And it's very esoteric. This is very esoteric. And Prabhupada was the manifestation of that karuna, extending out from Bengal. Otherwise, I would not be here today with the name Mathura Das. Zubin would not be interviewing me, and he would, and all of my reality that makes me Mathura Das would not be if Chaitanya Mahaprabhu hadn't come. And there is actually a very famous bhajan, which I don't know the Bengali, unfortunately, but it was like, what would have happened if Chaitanya Mahaprabhu hadn't come? And now for a lot of people it's insignificant, but I feel that for all those people, millions around the world, who've been touched by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the last 40 years, and the millions more that are going to be touched, it's going to become very significant. And this is at the essence. And not only that, the prophecy, many prophecies, every town and village, he said, my name will be heard. And so this is how things happen, spiritual paradigms happen. Christianity only became a mainstream religion 300 years after Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And who knows exactly what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wants to happen with this whole expansion of divine love. But he wants people to experience that love, whether it's in the form of an institution or not an institution, or is immaterial. And I think that Srila Prabhupada knew that, and he came to set up a certain organization because he was very humble and following in the footsteps of his Guru Maharaj, Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, and adopting the format that had flowed in time from his guru, Bhaktivedanta Thakur. And that's where the seeds of the whole modern Gaudiya Vaishnava movement come from in the world, from Bhaktivedanta Thakur in the period of modernization and reinterpretation of the whole Hindu culture. So that's a little bit about the Caitanya-Caritāmṛta. What I'm going to attempt to do is give now is a brief history, as far as I can give, of the whole of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, how it came to the West, and then carry on with the kind of the history of Iskcon. So after Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu disappeared in 1533, very mysterious how he passed as well. Some people say he merged into Gopinath, the deity, some people into Jagannath, some people into the sea, and there's even conspiracy theorists, and I won't get into that, but I have met conspiracy theorists that believe something else happened. But in the literature and the acharyas, they believe he disappeared quite mysteriously. And his main followers were called the Six Goswamis, specifically two brothers who were called Rupa and Sanatan. I won't get into all of the detail of their past, but they wrote most of along with their nephew Jiva Goswami, they wrote the prime texts of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. They were instructed by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to do that. Not only that, but to resurrect the lost place of Vrindavan, which was actually in those times just forests. And the Maharajas, different kings of the Rajput kingdom, Man Singh, he became a follower of Rupa Goswami and built the Radha Govindaji temple. And Sanatan Goswami, there's a whole story with a rich merchant who helped build the Madan Mohan. And then you had Radha Raman, and all the different temples established, and a whole culture started. In fact, a whole culture, I can call it the Golden Triangle. Bengal, Orissa, even though that was part of Bengal, Puri, and Vrindavan. This is where the kind of Gaudiya culture flourished. And Bengal, it started to spread after Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's time. The kind of next wave, you could say, were three Vaishnavas, Narottam, Srinivas, and Shyamananda, from Bengal and Orissa, and they came after Krṣṇadāsa Kavirāja Gosvāmī to Braj for about 6, 7, 8 years. And they collected all the different manuscripts that the Goswamis had written, because a lot of the literature and the metaphysics had been developed in Vrindavan outside of Bengal, and then it had to be brought back and distributed and passed around on handwritten manuscripts. And there's a long story how they got robbed on the way, when they were on the way back, and they're taking all of the books in a bullock cart. And then one of the Maharajas of Vishnupur became a follower of Shyamananda and got all the books back. Narottam returned to his place in Khetri in Bangladesh and instigated the first kind of Leela Kirtan, and that it's described in a later text called the Bhakti Ratnakara. I'll get into that later. Beautiful text. I did a lot of research in that text. It's one of the few texts, or the only text in Gaudiya Vaishnavism that refers to music, proving that Gaudiya Vaishnavism has a very, very rich musical cultural heritage. And to give an example, one of Narottam's most prominent disciples was called Gangadhar Chakravarti, and he actually converted the king of Manipur. And so Vaishnavism spread all over Bengal, Mizoram, Bangladesh, which is now Bangladesh, and a lot of Orissa. And then it also kind of went a bit more internal. The kind of emphasis kind of went off a little bit of the congregational chanting of the holy names, and a kind of very esoteric form of bhakti was introduced by Gopal Guru Goswami. And this is it's quite esoteric, and it's the Raga Bhakti, Raganuga Bhakti Sadhana. And there's a lot of literature that was developed around this period. And you have to understand, India was getting more under the Muslim rule at this time. There was different rulers ruling, so it went through different. There were different sociological, historical things influencing the culture. And then you could say, and then during the next great Vaishnava in the Gaudiya Vaishnava lineage was Vishwanath Chakravarti in the 18th century, and wrote lots of amazing commentaries. As a very extreme Rasik Bhakta, and Baladev Vidyabhushan, who was kind of his disciple he wrote the first actual commentary on Vedanta Sutra that was presented on Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the commentary on Vedanta Sutra that was presented in Jaipur, because the Murti of Radha Govindaji had moved from Vrindavan to Jaipur during the Muslim time. A lot of the deities left for protection under Rajput kings, and I think it was during the time of Jai Singh, there was a lot of Ramanandi priests, and they were contesting the authenticity of the Gaudiyas as an actual sampradaya. And so Baladev Vidyabhushan, he was the Vaishnava most prominent at that time in Jaipur. He went to Vishwanath Chakravarti in Vrindavan, and Vishwanath Chakravarti said, just depend on Krishna and he will write the commentary through you. So he's written the commentary, and it's called Govinda Bhasya. In fact, Prabhupada, in his introduction to Bhagavad Gita, he writes in the beginning, to Baladev, who presented Govinda Bhasya so nicely. And a lot of the most important, interesting things that have really convinced me about the magnificent metaphysics and theology of Gaudiya Vaishnavism are things that were based on this commentary by Baladev. They were solidified, lots of the ideas of the Goswamis into this commentary. And I've been very influenced. All the main kind of ideas of Achintya Abheda Tattva, which is the philosophical system that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was purporting. But that came only written in the 18th century. Then there's a kind of a period in the Gaudiya Vaishnavism where it kind of, during the period you could say, just when the British and things were changing in India, a lot of things were going on. And the next kind of prominent period on personality, who was to kind of be the inspiration, and without him the Krishna movement really wouldn't have spread to the West, was Kedaranath Dutt, who later became known as Bhaktivedanta Thakur. And there's a very wonderful book called Hindu Encounter with Modernity by Śrī, if anybody's interested, that will explain all the amazing historical context of what were happening in British India and Calcutta, amongst the Bhadralok, the middle class, upper middle class, educated of the Bengali, who were the first generation really in India to be seriously educated in English, because this is what the British were trying to do. They were trying to educate a class of Indians who could rule India for them. And it's a very interesting social experiment. And also printing presses, technology starting. So these are very important things, time, sociological phenomena. And Kedaranath Dutt, Bhaktivedanta Thakur, he rediscovered the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, wrote amazing texts. And if you read about his life, it's incredible. He slept 2 hours a day, had a family of 19 or more children, was a magistrate under the British, as well as doing all of his devotional things. He was like a Superman. And he wrote lots of beautiful poetry, and I have so much regard for Bhaktivedanta Thakur. Now, of his great family, 2 of his children were to become prominent Vaishnavas. The most famous was Bimala Prasad, was to become Bhaktivedanta Saraswati. And he had another brother, younger brother, called Lalit Prasad. And it's kind of interesting that the development and what the 2 brothers represented. Because what happened was, when Bhaktivedanta Thakur was searching for the roots and rediscovering Vaishnavism, it was because he wasn't born a Vaishnava, he was born actually a Shakta. And it was really kind of in the association of the Tagores and the young intelligentsia of the time in Calcutta, where they would discuss all these philosophies, that he became very interested in Chaitanya and did research. It was quite hard to even get a copy of Caitanya-Caritāmṛta to show you how kind of obscure things were in those days. And so he did a lot of research before he actually decided to take initiation in the lineage. And his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he took off his sacred thread when he became a Vaishnava. Now, his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had a real problem. His main gripe was with caste Brahmins and hereditary Goswamis, who had been keeping the Vaishnava family alive through hereditary lineages. He didn't think that was a necessary qualification. And so he had, somehow or other, he didn't regard Bipin Bihari Goswami, who gave Diksha to Bhaktivedanta Thakur, too highly, in a sense. I don't know the exact details of it, but he decided, you see, Bhaktivedanta Thakur, he took initiation. The whole process of Vaishnavism goes through finding a guru and taking mantra from the guru and following your spiritual path. So Bhaktivedanta Thakur took his mantra, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati didn't want to take the mantra for Diksha from Bhaktivedanta Thakur because he had a problem with Bipin Bihari Goswami. But his other son, Lalit, didn't have a problem. Now, at that time, Bhaktivedanta Thakur, while he was expressing and developing his Vaishnavism, he wasn't rocking the boat. He was actually, if you read all the anecdotes and the reviews of people at the time, he was a very, very respected gentleman of his time. And it was quite controversial, the place where he selected through mystic visions, and the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was not unanimously accepted by many of the other Goswamis. And that became kind of almost a political statement in the later development of Vaishnavism. So his elder son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who became Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he ended up taking initiation from an illiterate Baba called Gaurkishore Das Babaji. Now, there's a lot of controversy over this because some people say that he only took it from a picture, and so I won't get into the details, but there's a lot of controversy in the different versions and branches. You have to understand, in 1870 or so, Bhaktivedanta Thakur predicted. I mean, it's outrageous in those days. You have to understand British India, that one day Japanese, Russians, English, Bengalis will dance together and chant Hare Krishna. In 1870, I mean, this was very revolutionary. This was not the concern of your average Bengali Goswami. That this message of Chaitanya was something none other than just in their small locality. Not to speak of India or the world. And in 1896, Bhaktivedanta Thakur had written a book called Śrī Caitanya, His Life and Precepts, and sent it to Emerson, Thoreau, and in a few libraries. It was found in the 60s in McGill University in 1896. And Prabhupada considered that kind of synchronistic act because he was born in that year, and he saw that as a symbol of the message of Mahaprabhu in that year going for the first time. So there's this thing going on with Bhaktivedanta Thakur, and with printing presses, magazines, newspapers, distributing literature to the middle class as the Indian society changed. So a whole new vision, a new way of looking at Vaishnavism, Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati went on a kind of very long fast before deciding to, and a long brat called a Purushcharan for many, many years, doing loads of mantras and living very austere, living quite a kind of outrageous lifestyle, not akin to his later lifestyle. It was in the mood of an avadut, which is somebody who's kind of almost appears like a madman. And very interesting. And he was a genius. He was a Naishtika brahmachari at the age of 5. He knew the whole of the Bhagavad Gita off by heart. He was writing commentaries on Surya Siddhanta astronomical texts in his teens. He was raised a sharp intellect. And if you ever read some of the books that he wrote it is in this Edwardian English. You can hardly understand the English. It's so intellectual. And he was very different. And he started the Goldia Mutt, and he started to cause a storm in Bengal and convert many intelligent upper-class Bengalis to become, give up their lives and become swamis. Kind of parallel with what was happening with the Ramakrishna Mission, was a very popular mission. And Bhaktivedanta Thakur and Ramakrishna were kind of contemporaries at the same time, even though I don't think they were into the same kind of trip. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati set up the Gaudiya Mutt, and he introduced things into this organization, Mutt, that actually had never existed in the tradition of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and this is what makes him extremely controversial in his time. People either kind of loved him or hated him. And there's all sorts of incidences about some of the local priests getting very upset about some of his antics and the way he dressed and the way he presented things and all of this. And he was very much challenging the status quo, caste Brahmins, caste Goswamis. So there was quite a thing going on there. And there's a very beautiful book published by Mandala Publications on the life of Bhakti, and you can see all the photographs and how he looked. He was amazingly tall, very imposing. And he had many, many learned disciples. He introduced saffron cloth. It didn't exist. He introduced the tree dandi, which was something that was more used by the Ramanuja South Indian Swamis. He even had his disciples dress in kind of like Jesuit clothing when some kind of lord came to Navadvip to not shock them. He was quite very, very radical. And Abhay Charan Dey, who was later to become A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, was born in a Gaudiya Vaishnava family in Calcutta and got to meet Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati in 1922 through a friend. And he was a bit cynical of other Babas and people. He wasn't very impressed. He was more impressed by Gandhi at that time, the Quit India movement, very impressed. But when he met Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati on their first visit, he was very impressed by his dynamism, his intellect, and his conviction. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati on the first visit could see that he was educated in English and said that it is your duty, born in this tradition and a Vaishnava, to spread this to the Western-speaking world, right on that first meeting. So that's a very kind of interesting part of the Hare Krishna ripple, that first meeting. And so there's a book written by Satsvarup Goswami and some other people about all the what happened in Prabhupada's life that actually led to him eventually leaving his family. His pharmaceutical business as a married person didn't work out, and he ended up living in Vrindavan and taking sannyas from one of his godbrothers, who was called Keshava Maharaj. And what I'm going to do is maybe stop at the moment, and I'm going to give you a little explanation about what happened to the Goldia Mutt after Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's passing in 1936. It's interesting when you look at these historical processes, as we're looking at the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and how kind of Iskcon was created, because, you know, Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, the Goldia Mutt, was a kind of a phenomena that existed through the 20s to, you know, was created, and he passed in 1936. And you can see loads of the pictures. It was really quite, it's very, very, very powerful, big organisation. But the irony of this kind of loss of this story is that, you know, there's a very famous quote, quite a long quote, where Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, you know, actually says that religions are a cause of lots of major problems in the world. But he decided to establish an institution. Now, what happened was, he mentions that they started to build ashrams and mutts and temples. It was all very simple, a bit like Iskcon at the beginning. And one of the main centres was the Bug Bazaar in Calcutta, and you know, and he could actually see already people were becoming attached to rooms, to power, to position, and all of these types of things that happen when you get a group of people together. And to do something even spiritual, these things seem to happen. And when he passed, and there are some conspiracies about, you know, the possibility of him even being poisoned. I haven't seen the evidence, but these things are floated around the air. I've heard them. There's all sorts of unusual things that have gone on. Now, there were many different people in the Goldia Mutt, different swamis, different sannyasis, who had different amounts of power, even during the time of Bhaktivedanta Saraswati. And what happened was, there was a kind of a, I think at the beginning, Ananta Vasudev was the most prominent Vaishnava and respected intellectually, and the person who was the kind of go-getter, organisational person was Kunja, or Bhaktivedanta Maharaj. And after some time, what happened, Ananta Vasudev, this is very controversial, he said that he was going to leave, renounce his whole position in charge of the Bug Bazaar, and actually he was going to renounce Bhaktivedanta Saraswati and his teachings. And he went off and got married and decided to live a completely different spiritual type of life, and live in Vrindavan. And he wrote some books, very controversial books, criticising his guru and what he'd done. So it was very controversial, because a lot of the main points were about how he had introduced these new aspects to Gaudiya Vaishnavism that he could not find reference to. It was very controversial. And what happened was, the power kind of got split in the Goldia Mutt between their different centres, and the Bug Bazaar Mutt was taken over under certain conditions by Odlomi Maharaj. There was all sorts of political and legal reasons. And Odlomi Maharaj happened to be the brother of Keshava Maharaj, who later was very close to Prabhupada and was his sannyas guru. And there were other people like Sridhar Maharaj, and I'm trying to think of some of the other names. They'll maybe come to me in a minute. Many of the different swamis, they didn't kind of like the two branches that were being formed, so they went off and did their own thing. So basically what happened was, a unified movement became fragmented in a nutshell. And Prabhupada was obviously quite sad. He was a married man at that time, and he could see where what had happened to it. But even in the last letters that he'd had with Bhaktivedanta Saraswati, like 2 weeks before he passed in 1936, the directive and the orders were, please, your duty is to spread this in English. So from then on, that was Prabhupad's mission. He even started printing his own magazine, his Back to Godhead, and his close friend was Sridhar Maharaj, who actually lived with him in Calcutta. And then, as I said, he left his family and ended up going to Vrindavan as a Vanaprastha and then taking sannyas, I think in 1959, if I'm quite right. And Narayan Maharaj, who was a brahmachari at that time, kind of made his Tridandi. There's a famous picture with Keshava Maharaj, Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami and Bhaktivedanta Muni, another godbrother who'd taken sannyas. So these are all the journeys. And there's a lovely book by Mullah Pakriti called Remembering Srila Prabhupada, which is a collection of people in India that knew Prabhupada long before he went to the West, and who he was and what he'd said. And it's incredible. Everybody said all the time you would meet him, he would just keep telling them and boring them about how he was going to go to the West and do this. And they're going, yeah, Swamiji, sure, you know. And he got, and the money that he had made from his chemistry, he got lessened, and he became very, very poor, living in Vrindavan. And eventually, by luck of Sumati Maharaji, a very rich Vaishnava lady owning the Scindia shipping line, he eventually got a free passage on on her boat, the Jaladuta, and he got from a gentleman in Mathura whose son lived in Butler, Pennsylvania, Mr. Agarwal, he got a kind of sponsorship letter. And it's all very interesting because the laws in immigration were all going through huge big changes at this time, unbeknown to, of course, Srila Prabhupada, but this was going to also affect the destiny of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So at the amazing age of 68, he was born in 1956 and 1965. He had suffered 2 heart attacks upon the boat. Bhaktivedanta Swami arrived. And there's an amazing poem that he wrote called Markandeya Bhagavata, when he first came into Boston Harbor and saw the kind of the skyline of the cities, western cities, and he looked at it and it starts off, "My dear Lord, I don't know why you have brought me here, but you have." And there's a beautiful poem that carries on, and it's a poem of complete surrendering. He's saying, "I have no power. Only by your power can anything I say have any kind of reach these people, and therefore I'm totally surrendering to you." And it's absolutely wonderful. And it's another. I realise that me, Mathura, the fact that I'm here with this name and interested in Krishna is a lot to do with that prayer and surrender of Prabhupada. Total surrender. You have to try and imagine having 2 heart attacks, being 68. A few rupees, cartels, some volumes of Bhagavatam that you've gone to great endeavour translating and struggling to print over the years before, and then you're arriving with just 1 contact. So that's the beginning of actually what happened. I'm not going to try and get into too much detail, because it's all very well documented in certain books, especially Planting the Seed by Satsvarup Goswami, which is the official version. But what happened was, Prabhupada arriving at that time in America was a huge change in the Western culture. And basically what was happening was a few people had gone to India already, and a few people were experimenting with psychedelic drugs and having mind-expanding experiences. And the seeds of the counterculture, even the name hippie hadn't even been created. The word kind of hippie came in 1967, sorry. And so a group of people met Prabhupada. It's a long story, but in downtown New York, he had no money. He'd been staying with Ramamurti Mishra, and then they'd kind of parted ways, and he had no money, and he was living in the Bowery. And he met these people who bumped into him onto the street, and they saw him in saffron robes. And they said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm a Swami." And then they went back to his little place, a little loft, had a Bhagavad Gita class, and the next thing you know, they brought their friends, and that's how basically the Krishna movement started in America, in New York. And within a year and a half, it had gone to San Francisco, the Summer of Love. Prabhupada, famous footage of Prabhupada, first of all chanting in Tompkins Park, beautiful footage with Allen Ginsberg and the early devotees in black and white. It was very revolutionary. Allen Ginsberg called Prabhupada the downtown Swami, whereas people like Krishnamurti were uptown living in swanky apartments. And Prabhupada was down there with the people where it was all going on. And this is how destiny, this is where Krishna brought Prabhupada to these people. These were the generation of people that were really open and looking and wanting something different, some alternative. And Prabhupada appeared at that time. The immigration laws changed, which allowed Prabhupada to stay, which is quite incredible. And also the Pope visited America, and there was a whole new attitude in America and the West towards different religions and different cultures. There was much more openness, so there was a huge big change going on. And in 1966, Prabhupada founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and it started to develop. Went to Montreal. My friend Badaraj was in the room with John Lennon singing "Give Peace a Chance," and then they arrived, 3 couples in London, Shyamasundar and his wife, Malati, and Guru Das and Mukunda and their wives, and they and Jamuna, the cook, famous cook, Guru Das and Jamuna, and Shyamasundar became a very good close friend of George Harrison. There's fabulous stories how that happened, and George Harrison had already been hearing one of the very early records that Prabhupada had made in New York of the Mahamantra, and was waiting to meet Krishna devotees. And they became very, very close. And George Harrison became one of the most influential people in spreading the message of Krishna. He had a big sense of humour, and in one of the little books that has been printed and talks with him, it's called Chant and Be Happy, he says that it was a kind of, he thought, wonder what would happen being a Beatle, Apple Records, if you made a single of a mantra, what would happen? And it was incredible, it went everywhere. As a kid of 11, I was hearing Hare Krishna on the Isle of Wight when I was, while the festival was going on, Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan. I was driving with my parents hearing Hare Krishna on the radio. It became number one in Yugoslavia for 9 weeks. It was a phenomenon. And because George Harrison being one of the most influential and cool and wonderful hip people in the world at that time, I was, I had a positive feeling about it. And in about 1970, Prabhupada created what was called the GBC, the General Body Commission, to try and organise the movement as it was growing and as the literature was being translated. And I came into the story in 1973, and I joined in Amsterdam as part of my book and part of my story. But I'm not really going to talk about my own individual story here. This is more like the history of Iskcon. Iskcon started to develop and all sorts of fundraising tactics through selling records and books and paraphernalia, which allowed huge amount of money to come into Iskcon, but it also developed a certain kind of mindset in the devotees. And Prabhupada was very old when he started, was trying to put as much endeavour as he could into publishing books, because he knew that he would go, and he was very he really wanted his disciples to understand the culture, so he put all of his energy into writing literature. And then around 1977 beginning, he started to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and everybody knew that Prabhupada might not have long to go. And then a very controversial conversation took place at his bedside in Vrindavan about the succession of the lineage, which to this day has caused lots of controversy. And the main 11 GBCs were meant to carry on giving the mantra after Prabhupada passed. And in 14th of November 1977, I was there. Prabhupada left from this world. And none of us really in the Krishna movement who've been in it for many years knew where actually it was all going. We were all in quite shock. Everything was from Prabhupada. And then at the big Mayapur meeting, because every year there's an international meeting, in 1978, this is where the big change could come. You could say, if we're going to, like you were talking about the Mahabharata, the inauspicious omens that appeared in the Mahabharata at the time when Yudhisthira lost the and all of this. This for me is equivalent, and for many people looking at the lineage, something happened, and these 11 took it upon themselves to interpret their role of guru in a very, very grandiose way, to put it lightly. And it took quite a few of the Krishna movement people, old members, to watch the development, and it became quite painful. They divided up the world into zones. If you wanted to be a member of the Krishna movement at that time, it meant promoting the movement and recruiting people to become disciples of these new gurus who were morphing and changing as we were watching them. They were all quite respected before they became gurus, and not always liked, but respected because they had some kind of shakti, some charisma, some managerial qualities, possibly because that's not always true. And so basically, Iskcon started to be kind of like moulded into their idea of what the Krishna conscious movement was going to be. And if you didn't fit into their plan, then there was no real room for you. In fact, you were a threat. And there's lots of kind of quite nasty stories. Now, I lasted within the institution, the Krishna movement, after this, for a couple of years, and I left in the beginning of 1980 after a long discussion with one of the leaders at that time, Bhagavan. I won't get into the details of it, but I realised at that discussion that actually I thought about things more. I had my own ideas about where this the original idea of what Prabhupada wanted, and I realized that these people, I didn't agree with their vision. And I didn't really want to be part of what they were doing, and I felt that I personally could not kind of wave this Iskcon banner anymore as being the kind of representative movement of purely following the Krishna's path. It was a very, very deep decision for me today, because I'd imbibed so many beautiful things, so many wonderful things from Prabhupada, from my god brothers and god sisters, had so many fantastic experiences. So it was a very, very big step. And this was I was just one. All over the world, especially in America, Iskcon went into a huge, massive kind of like decline in certain areas. And some of these gurus became very, very popular, and they attracted huge amount of followers, fanatical followers. And I left the institution and I started to watch the whole thing from the outside, and it started to develop. And many people like me in the movement, they didn't, well, not everybody actually had such a I had a kind of quite a civilized parting. I had kind of offered my resignation and with a nice kind of civilized talk with Bhagavan. Some people had some very, very bitter experiences, violent. And one of the really awful developments in this whole story is a friend, a god brother called Sulochan. He wanted to expose the gurus for what they were doing, and went on a kind of mission, because one of the gurus, Kirtanananda, Prabhupada's very first disciple and first sannyasi, had set up a centre called New Vrindavan in West Virginia, had initiated his wife while he'd been away in India. And when he came back, he found that she was like a kind of totally under his spell. And this is what was going on in Iskcon. These women were people getting married, husbands were having their wives being totally controlled by gurus. Very strange things were going on. And he went on a big mission. He started writing things, going to the local police, trying to tell them what was going on, lots of dodgy things that were happening. And it's very painful, because he was, at his last night, he was with a friend of mine in Los Angeles, who I've just been to, and we were talking about the story, and he knew that people were after him. They wanted to do something to him. And my friend was offering him to stay the night. He said, no, I don't want to bring anything to your house. And he went down the road, his van was parked there, and my friend was just falling asleep. And suddenly, he heard this. He thought it was maybe a car backfiring, but it wasn't. It was some bullets being put into the head of Sulochan. Now, this is terrible. You know, this is one of the awful things that were happening at this period. It's one of the symptoms of the what was happening of these gurus. And eventually, Kirtanananda had sent a hitman, and Kirtanananda's hitman went to jail. They went to jail, and all sorts of things happened. And in 1984, there was a big article written in Rolling Stone magazine called Dialogue for Murder, and then there was a follow-up called an expose by these same journalists called Monkey on a Stick, with this story of Sulochan as the main story. And what happened also during that period was that in 1986, 3 of the big gurus left Iskcon. So a whole branch started to go off from Sridhar Maharaj, of people who were disenfranchised with Iskcon, dissatisfied, and there was this kind of old school Tig thing going on, and people who were kind of quite charismatic but not in the A list, the B list, they weren't kind of moving up, and they decided, well, this is what I think, they weren't getting it in Iskcon, so they kind of went over and formed their own little organisation with Sridhar Maharaj, and they could there be big shots as well. They could be like the GBC's Iskcon. And that went on for a while until Sridhar Maharaj himself passed away, and then some of them were not happy with the next Acharya, Govinda Maharaj, and they decided to branch off again. So there's been branches and branches. And then during this time also Narayan Maharaj, who was not one of Prabhupada's godbrothers, but very close to him, and a disciple of Narayan of Keshava Maharaj, foreign Western disciples started going to see him because they weren't happy with the Western gurus. And then what happened was Iskcon decided to make loads of gurus. Instead of having just a few with zonal, they realized, no, we've done a mistake. We're going to kind of open guruship to loads of people. And so this is the strange way through the reforms that the Krishna movement has been going. And it's been very different in different countries. In America, it went on a big decline. In England and in Europe, there's been these different regimes happening, and people followers of this guru. Some people have had 3 names from different gurus. And after a while, people started to just get, I was cynical from the beginning, but then more and more people started coming and going and coming and going. It started, one of the big gurus, Harikesh, became huge in Russia when there was a whole, that was a big development in the whole Iskcon's movement before the Iron Curtain came down, and President Hawke being instrumental in releasing 50 or 60 Russian Hare Krishnas from labor camps for just having Bhagavad Gitas. A lot of publicity. It created a huge wave in the Krishna movement. Poland, Central Europe, all over there started to grow while it started declining. So it's and then in India, it's just been growing and growing and growing. The Indian gurus, Gopal Krishna and Bhakti Charu and Radhanath and big centres being Jaipataka Maharaj, they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of disciples, and they've created an institution. It's growing, and they've got lots of people becoming members. In India, the whole kind of like mood has been really on Marawari life members, and so kind of Iskcon has been very kind of coloured by the whole kind of Marawari kind of a nouveau rich kind of mentality. And I was just talking with, you can actually have the slumdog millionaire dream by being part of Iskcon in India. You can come from nowhere, rise up, and you can become a big member, and even marry a foreign wife and travel around the world. Join Iskcon and see the world. So it's a very different thing, Iskcon, than it was when I joined and when I left. And different strokes for different folks. I have my own criticisms and feelings about the institution. It has its own shape and form. And what I'm seeing now, as I've mentioned before, is a new kind of alternative, simultaneous, non-aligned movement of people who... for me, I go and visit Iskcon centres now and then, but I can't be part of the whole organisation or institution. It's just not for me. It's not my cup of tea. And it might be for some people, but Krishna can be expressed in lots of other beautiful ways. And I think I've talked quite a lot now. And I think you've got a synopsis of a little bit of the history of the Krishna movement. There's lots more going on. And if you want to know, you can always kind of inquire through Mathura and check out all sorts of lots of details on different websites. Thank you.